The noir may just be one of the most iconic and strange movie genres out there. Because, among other things, nobody is even 100% sure what a noir is. Unlike pretty much every other film genre out there, a clear definition of what can and can't be considered a noir has never been made, leading to many debates over the years as to whether certain movies can be considered noirs or not. Though there is still most definitely certain criteria that must be met for a movie to actually be considered a part of the genre. But that being said, one thing that isn't a requirement of noirs that most people might assume at first is a sad, downbeat, or otherwise bad ending. Because believe it or not, there are many, many classic noirs in existence that don't have that particular distinction at all. And yet there's absolutely no question that they are considered quintessential examples of film noir. And when noirs did take this approach of not having a completely downer ending and instead having an at least somewhat hopeful resolution, it can lead to a very interesting analysis of what it's all trying to say. And today, I'd like to explore this topic in detail to the best of my ability. And there will be spoilers for quite a few noirs ahead, classic or otherwise. So in case there's a particular movie you'd like to see for yourself first and don't want to know what happens, you should probably be on the lookout. Now please note that I will not be giving out any other spoiler warnings in this video. Okay, so to start with a brief overview first, and as I touched on before, film experts have never given a concrete definition as to what the noir genre actually is. So as a result, it can often lead to a debate as to what kinds of movies can and can't be considered part of it. But as I already said, there are definitely ways to narrow it down. Because in order for a movie to be considered a noir, it must be in black and white. And that in particular is important. If a movie is in color, it automatically can't be considered a noir, even if it fits everything else about the genre to a T. Have a somewhat downtrodden, if not outright paranoid, atmosphere, at least one morally ambiguous character, and at least one murder, on or off screen, must take place. Now other common staples of noirs, but aren't required to be considered a part of the genre, are flashbacks, femme fatales, psychotic hitmen, detectives, double crosses, shootouts, and car chases. But you notice none of this mentions how noirs must end? Because here's the thing. The belief that noirs always had a sad or unhappy ending comes from what would evolve from the noir, the neo-noir, which is basically any noir made after the 1960s and is in color. But one thing that heavily separates neo-noirs from plain old noirs is that neo-noirs almost always have a tragic ending. Because neo-noirs are defined by straight-up nihilism, while noirs were defined more by the fear of hopelessness. And movies like Seven and Chinatown perfectly show this evolution of the noir, where characters go from trying to maintain hope in their lives to straight up living in a world without God, where the devil reigns supreme. If you'll pardon the overly religious comparison. But part of this extends to when the genres in question came into existence. The noir was in its prime when audiences still held hope in every situation and wanted to see some kind of moral victory in the end, no matter how small while the neo-noir would come out once audiences wanted something darker, edgier, and were more jaded after being plagued by war and other cultural problems. And as a consequence, noirs often weren't as hopeless and nihilistic as their modern counterparts would have you believe. And this immediately becomes apparent if you go back to the dawn of the noir in the early 1940s. Now listen, I'm no film historian, so I'm not even going to attempt a history lesson on how the noir came to be. All I'll say is that the genre was heavily influenced by German Expressionism, brought on by many talented Germans having to flee their native country due to the rising tensions of World War II, and therefore made their contributions to Hollywood much more direct. But one of the biggest influences had to be Fritz Lang. There were many others, most definitely, but Lang is often given a lot of credit when it comes to German expression being brought into Hollywood films. And as a result, he had a major impact on the noir genre. He even directed what many would consider to be a noir masterpiece, complete with a downright tragic ending, Scarlet Street. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's take a look at what some historians consider to be the first noir, and what others consider to be more an example of the proto-noir. And that would be Stranger on the Third Floor. The tale of a man who feels so guilty over sending a potentially innocent man to be executed that he starts to fear his neighbor was murdered by the titular stranger and he'll get blamed for it. And let's just say, for a movie that doesn't even clock out at an hour and 10 minutes, it's pretty dang memorable. And many elements that would later become staples of the noir genre are present here, but it's also a lot more hands-on when it comes to the psychological paranoia it evokes, as opposed to later noirs that tended to handle those feelings with more subtlety. So in the end, the movie ends up playing out more like an hour-long stress dream or nightmare than a conventional movie. In many ways, it's just weird and very unsettling, to the point that Peter freaking Lorre, playing an absolutely psychotic serial killer, is actually one of the less unnerving aspects of it. But it also has a happy ending. Lorre is killed and both men are proven innocent and set free. And it creates this weird paradox of satisfaction with all of the fear and paranoia of what came before, creating this very odd feeling of optimism and pessimism, fear and hopefulness all at the same time. And this is a feeling that many true noirs that came afterwards would manage to perfect when they chose to not go with an out-and-out tragic ending. And there are actually many examples of this. But to start with just one, there's Laura, usually considered to be one of the best noirs ever made, which tells the story of a detective falling in love with a woman while investigating her murder. Sounds like a clear-cut case of a detective ending up in the loony bin after being driven nuts by a case, right? Well, not exactly. Because it turns out that the woman in question is actually alive because the woman who actually was killed was simply mistaken for her due to many different factors. And in the end, not only is the detective able to save her before the murderer can finish her off, but it's also implied that she's started to fall in love with him as well. Obviously, it still doesn't have the happiest ending by any means, but on the whole, one has to admit that's a pretty hopeful one nonetheless, and that's part of what makes the whole thing work. Or even take Gilda, one of the most famous noirs ever made, because it might surprise many to learn that this movie actually has a completely happy ending. for all the danger and mind games the characters are put through, it ends just about as optimistically as one could hope for. Though, granted, in this case it's only technically a happy ending, since one has to wonder if a healthy relationship between the two could ever actually work out, and one would almost certainly say it's just a matter of time before the two destroy themselves. But the fact still remains that, at least technically speaking, this movie is meant to have a happy ending, and is also unquestionably a noir. But that being said, that's not to say that happy endings in noirs were all that common, as trying to make an out-and-out happy conclusion with some of the things that go down in movies of that nature is pretty much impossible. So instead, what noirs would more often do is have the ending be on the more bittersweet side than an outright sad one. Now, just how bitter and sweet these endings were tended to vary depending on the individual film, but the point still remains that many noirs did tend to end with at least some glimmer of hope. And a good example of this would be The Postman Always Rings Twice, because while the movie does end on a pretty sad note, with the main character accidentally killing his love interest just after they had affirmed their love for each other, and is then unjustly sent to be executed for her murder, he at least takes some solace in the fact that the police found out about his involvement in a murder he actually was responsible for, and can at least die believing he's being punished for a crime he did commit. Again, it's certainly no happy ending, but it's not totally nihilistic either, as it at least has something to offer. But this would still definitely be a case of leaning a lot more into the bitter than sweet side of things. Or for another example of that, take the classic noir Out of the Past. Because despite his best efforts, Jeff isn't able to run away from his past or save himself from it, being outsmarted by Katie at almost every turn. So running low on options, he pretty much does the only thing he can do: put a target on his own back in an effort to stop her. And in the end, it works. Katie is killed, which puts an end to the whole crime ring, but he also dies in the process. But on top of that, his mute friend also lies to his girlfriend afterwards, so that she'll forget about Jeff and start a new life with another man that's been pursuing her. So once again, while it's definitely not a happy ending, it's not really a tragic one either. Obviously it's tragic for Jeff, but at least in dying, he also took down Katie with him, and his friend ensures that the woman he loved doesn't ruin her own life carrying the torch for him. And once again, the conflicting feelings of bitter and sweet from an ending like this is a very odd one that only a noir could really evoke. Or for a third example, take the minor noir classic This Gun for Hire. Telling the story of a nihilistic hitman who's set up by an evil weapons manufacturer, this movie actually has a better ending than it has any right to. Because over the course of the story, we learn that he only came to be the way he was because of a lifetime of abuse, and came to hate the entire human race because nobody ever loved him or would give him a chance. So after learning this, he's persuaded by a compassionate woman named Ellen to try and do something good by helping her boyfriend find out who these people he wants to get revenge on actually are and confess to what they've been doing. And surprisingly enough, he actually does it, getting a written confession from the leading men before causing, directly or indirectly, both their deaths. But because one conversation with an understanding woman can erase a lifetime of crimes and cynicism, he dies shortly thereafter in a shootout with the police. But he lives just long enough to be congratulated and thanked by the police, allowing him to die at peace with the knowledge that he did do something good. And on top of that, both Ellen and her boyfriend, probably the two most sympathetic characters in the entire movie, survived completely unscathed. And once again, that's actually a pretty uplifting ending, all things considered, if obviously not a totally happy one. Now, please do note here that none of this is to say that there weren't any noirs to end on a totally tragic and downtrodden note, as there was still plenty of those too. Scarlet Street, as I mentioned earlier, has a very sad ending even by noir standards. Or there's also The Third Man. Sure, Harry Lime's crime ring is stopped, but Martins is forced to kill his best friend, have his spirit almost completely shattered, and loses his chance at getting the girl. So while it can't exactly be considered a total loss as far as the ending goes, it's still a lot more in line with what one would expect from the genre. And then there's what's considered perhaps the most downbeat movie made during the entire golden age of Hollywood, DOA. The story of a simple man who finds out he drank a slow-acting poison and only has a few days to live with absolutely no hope of recovery. And after somewhat coming to terms with that, he becomes determined to find out why he was set up to be murdered and get his revenge before he himself expires. And the movie does not shy away from his complete and total distress at finding out he's a doomed man, complete with his girlfriend, who doesn't know about his condition, taking plenty of time to affirm her love for him as well. And to add insult to injury, it turns out he was murdered all because he signed a piece of paper that had absolutely no significance to him. Meaning that he was basically no threat to the people that had him killed in the first place. So in the end, all the audience is really left with, as far as comfort goes, is that he gets his revenge and exposes the entire racket to the police. But even that isn't much, because as I said before, the movie is really about the total tragedy of a man having to come to grips with his own death, only to find out it was basically for nothing. And in the end, there's no saving him, as he simply drops dead after telling everything to the police. Really, this movie is infamous for being so depressing that silly sound effects were actually added to an early party scene just to help lighten the mood slightly. Or take another noir called The Killers, based off the short story by Ernest Hemingway. Because for all intents and purposes, this movie does have a pretty downer ending, to the point that it's actually parodied within the movie. Swede dies after resigning himself to a small life, everybody that was part of his gang is killed, and Ava Gardner plays one of the most treacherous femme fatales you'll ever see. And as is pointed out, while the insurance investigator solves the case, his victory doesn't even improve the company by a single percentage. But that being said, that victory doesn't come so much in the fact that he did good for his company, but that he brought a bunch of criminals to justice in one form or another and ensured that they were stopped forever. So it's not like the ending is totally downbeat or that his triumph was entirely meaningless. But it's still apt to feel depressing, if only for how tragic Swede's life is, as he screwed it all up trusting the wrong woman who then betrays him, and he takes it so hard that he nearly ends it all before a kind cleaning woman convinces him not to. And just as he was starting to put a small life together for himself, He realizes he's a marked man and simply accepts it, waiting for the end to come. Seriously, Burt Lancaster plays perhaps the best dead man walking or doomed man just waiting for death portrayal you'll ever see, as it only makes his end even more tragic. Again, it's only in the fact that the insurance detective accidentally avenges his murder and betrayal after the fact that gives his story anything resembling a bittersweet ending. And as with the aforementioned examples of the bittersweet feeling, it just works. To the point that Ernest Hemingway himself had nothing but praise for all the changes and additions they made to his story. And honestly, the same can be said for another adaptation of a classic novella, even if it has nothing to do with the noir genre, which is The Time Machine. The book that started everybody's fascination with the idea of time travel. The book tells the story of a time traveler who goes into the future looking for the golden age of mankind, only to quickly learn that man destroyed themselves soon after his time and slowly degenerate into mindless monsters. And all of this was in keeping with H.G. Wells' very cynical outlook of mankind. He figured it was only a matter of time before humans' arrogance, hubris, and short-sightedness would lead to complete ruin and doom everybody's accomplishments to ultimately be for nothing. The 1960 movie adaptation, however, offers a slightly different take on Wells' story. As while mankind's arrogance, hubris, and short-sightedness still dooms the world and all who inhabit it, there's still hope offered in the fact that the future can be saved due to the time traveler's interference, as the Eloi, which are basically the descendants of humans, are shown to still be capable of learning. So with the right teacher, they can theoretically rebuild a society similar to our own, and maybe one that contains a few less flaws at that. And once again, the way H.G. Wells' inherent pessimism about the future clashes with the more optimistic approach of the film just makes for the perfect balance, evoking a feeling not unsimilar to what noirs can evoke. Now, by this point you might be wondering, what's my point with all of this? That stories that manage to get the right mixture of optimism and pessimism, especially in their endings, is just able to create an extremely odd sense of hopefulness that few other stories can. And I've singled out the noir genre in this case, specifically because it tended to do the best job at this. Because while their stories are usually by nature downtrodden, when their movies manage to end on a more bittersweet, or even downright happy, note, it's able to evoke that feeling I was just describing almost without trying every single time. Now, as I noted before, this isn't to say that every noir succeeded at this, or that there weren't any noirs that just had straight up tragic endings, because there were most definitely plenty of both of those. My only point here is that when they were more bittersweet and did it right, they usually made for the perfect paradox of optimism and pessimism. And why is this so significant, you might also be wondering? Because that paradox basically sums up humanity as a whole. Those noirs sum up the struggle of every human being. That life can be extremely tough and sometimes feel hopeless and like there's no way out. But that we always hold on to that glimmer of hope that things will work out for us regardless. To put it simply, Most people's entire lives are a never ending paradox of hopefulness and cynicism, the eternal fight between thinking positive and succumbing to the negative, believing that life will never get any better and hoping it will. Basically, life is hard, and most people do all they can to try and stay upbeat regardless of that. And it's that abstract, almost contradictory feeling of simultaneously giving up hope, but that determination to keep trying, that those noirs manage to capture so well. That feeling of glimmering hope and optimism in a sometimes brutal, unforgiving, and overly negative world. The need to find that silver lining in the face of tragedy, to believe that something good does come out of every bad thing that happens. And again, while there have been plenty of other movies to capture that same feeling, one of which I even went over before, I still believe that on the whole, the noir genre is most definitely the one that captured it best, in part by not always being totally nihilistic and going for a more bittersweet approach, which, in subtle ways, might have helped it stand out so much from other genres due to its ability to sum up those key aspects of human life. Okay, I think I've long made my point by now. And if you're still here, thank you for sticking it out and listening to everything I had to say. But now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you believe that on the whole the noir genre wasn't actually as hopeless in tone as most seem to believe it was, and that it was better off for it? Or do you simply think I have no idea what I was talking about? Please feel free to let me know whatever you think in the comments below. And sorry if I got a little existential at the end. I just figured it was the only way to get my point across and that it was something worth saying. But either way, please keep in mind that you do not have to agree with anything I said in this video if you don't want to. You can feel however you want about this or any other topic we discuss here, and that I nor anybody else can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate all of it. And I hope to see you all next time.